for disaster risk reduction. And I'm extremely delighted to have this opportunity to present a very futuristic topic. How can artificial intelligence reduce disaster risk in countries? We have a very distinguished panelist, but we are equally delighted that we have close to 2,000 participants from around the world who have registered for this session, and the vast majority have already joined. I will now introduce Mr. Bilal Jamousi, who is the Chief of the Study Group, Department of Telecommunication Standardization Bureau, International Telecommunication Union. Dr. Jamousi is with ITU for last 10 years, focusing on global standardization initiatives. Before joining ITU, Dr. Bilal was with Nortel for 15 years in Canada and then in the United States, where he held several leadership positions, including strategic standards, advanced technology, university research, software developments, and data network for major international customer networks. I did not introduce myself. Dr. Murali Tumarukudi, Crisis Management Branch of the United Nations Environment Program. Dr. Bilal, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It is really my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on the occasion of the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. Each year, man-made and natural disasters impact the lives of millions of people. Over the last 5 decades, the frequency of occurrence of these disasters is increasingly causing considerable loss of life, displacement of people, and destruction of infrastructure. Economic losses and damages caused by disasters in 2019 were estimated to be $232 billion. Focused and comprehensive solutions are needed, covering all 4 phases of disaster management, including mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, in order to minimize these losses. At ITU, we believe that information and communication technologies, or ICTs, can play a pivotal role in effective disaster management by boosting disaster preparedness and response. ITU, in its role as the United Nations Agency for ICTs, has been at the forefront of sharing best practices and formulating standards to facilitate the use of emergency radio communications, along with IoT, unmanned aerial vehicles, digital twin technologies, to counter these associated with disaster management. ITU conducts work on disaster management through its 3 sectors: radio communication, standardization, and development sector. Through its development sector, ITU plays an important role supporting its member states in preparedness and response activities. The ITU guidelines for developing national emergency telecommunication plans provide a step-by-step process on how to develop and implement a national emergency telecommunication plan. In relation to COVID-19 crisis, the development sector has prepared a guide for a telecommunications/ICT contingency plan, which will help support countries in ensuring network continuity and service delivery. Recognizing that communication networks could be disrupted in emergency situation, ITU has explored disaster relief applications and network resilience through its standard sectors focus group on disaster relief systems, network resilience, and recovery. ITU telecommunication standardization sector continues work on certain facets of disaster management through technical groups such as ITUT study groups. Currently, work is underway on standards relating to signaling architecture of the fast deployment emergency network in study group 11, metadata for disaster information preparedness with human factors, smart evacuation in study group 20, and the disability inclusive disaster risk reduction in study group 16, to name a few. Existing ITU standards on disaster management cover a range of topics, including disaster relief mobile message service, disaster voice message delivery service, common alerting protocol, disaster information services, audio-based indoor and outdoor network navigation systems for persons with vision impairment, and IoT-based automotive emergency response systems, among others. With the exponential evolution of artificial intelligence, it is time to deliberate on how AI-based solutions could help refine strategies on disaster prediction, planning, and response. AI's ability to quickly analyze large data sets makes it an invaluable resource during disasters. It can further be leveraged to refine data sets and accelerate intervention. AI can leverage remotely sensed data from satellites to examine changes to the Earth's surface to detect and mitigate any potential disasters, along with providing essential information in multiple languages. As the use of AI in the field of disaster management is still fairly new, there are certain burning questions which could be brought up. Let me raise one. In situations where emergency phone calls often do not work in the impacted area, how can AI be used to predict where rescue should be dispatched? While we are still exploring the possibilities, it is evident that AI can also be used for image recognition, for automatic damage mapping during critical situations, to help make potentially life-saving decisions and initiate rescue operations. Despite all its benefits, AI in disaster management is a double-edged sword. Are still in their early stages, and AI is still prone to problems of data bias and data manipulation. In this scenario, the use of AI does not undermine the need for coordinated disaster preparedness and human intervention. It merely seeks to fill gaps and improve outcomes during the disaster life cycle. Accordingly, the ITU development sector publication on disruptive technologies and their use in disaster risk reduction and management puts the spotlight on AI as a new and emerging technology that can hasten the spread of critical information, improve understanding of disasters, enhance early warning systems, assess damage in new ways, and add the knowledge base of the social behaviors and economic impacts after a crisis. The convergence of hardware advancements with artificial intelligence has churned out a plethora of solutions for each disaster management phase. Disaster relief robots and drone technologies are increasingly revolutionizing the way aid is delivered during disasters under dangerous circumstances. Such innovations are indispensable during the COVID-19 crisis. These successes, as well as queries, are paving the way for further exploration of AI standardization in the disaster risk reduction context. Work on this domain, however, cannot be conducted in isolation. ITU is already working with the World Food Programme's Emergency Telecommunication Cluster to develop a disaster connectivity map, which will use disruptive technologies to identify better ways of understanding connectivity gaps following disasters. The ITU, WMO, UNESCO-IOC Joint Task Force on Smart Submarine Cables also continues to investigate the use of submarine telecommunication cables for ocean and climate monitoring and disaster warning. As part of the United Nations community, we would also like to continue to work together to overcome the limitations of data gaps, data reliability, and improve the overall data readiness of countries for disaster prediction and monitoring systems. What would be the ideal way forward for this? These are a few of the questions we hope to find answers for during this webinar. Today, we're very pleased to have this session panel graced by leading experts in the field of disaster management, including representatives from the World Bank and our sister agencies, UNDRR and UN Environment. Strong collaboration within the UN system, along with partnership established with the public and private sectors, is the cornerstone for building trust in disaster management systems and attaining related targets in the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. This webinar, organized as part of the AI for Good Global Summit, is a small step towards that vision. The AI for Good Global Summit is organized by the ITU alongside X Prize Foundation, in partnership with 37 UN organizations, ACM, and co-convened with Switzerland. The summit has been identifying practical applications of AI to advance the Sustainable Development Goals and facilitating core discussions on the use of AI in different verticals, which have percolated into standardization streams, including health and mobility. During COVID-19 crisis, the AI Summit has gone digital, allowing us to reach even more people throughout the year. In the post-COVID-19 era, the discussions derived from the summit are even more valuable as they will continue to build on existing standardization work. On behalf of ITU, I would like to thank the moderator, Dr. Murali, and all the speakers for their contribution to the global dialogue on disaster management. I wish you all a very pleasant and interesting, productive discussion ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Bilal, for those wise words. You have already outlined a number of areas where AI could revolutionize disaster risk reduction and rescue operations. I am already noticing that we have participants all the way from Australia to Finland to Pakistan, Kenya. So I encourage those of you who joined the session to please type in where you have come from so that we can get a feel of which part of the globe currently we are speaking to. I also encourage all of you to use the question answer form section to ask your questions. We will try to pick up as many as possible and many in real time so that you can also get answers to the questions. You don't have to wait for each speaker to finish or all speakers to finish. You can continue to ask the questions. I would now invite Dr. Joanna Badstone, who is the director of the Data Futures Institute of the Monash University. It's a new center which was just established, and Joanna was selected after a global search, and she used to work for the IBM in the corporate strategy department. As the vice president, Joanna was responsible for data science and AI capabilities. In the new institute, she will be responsible for bringing together data science and AI capabilities across the university. So the interdisciplinary nature would be her speciality, what she brings into the session. Professor Badstone will also continue to establish a digital ecosystem which fosters collaborative interdisciplinary research and promote lasting industry engagements. An exceptional thought leader in the development and application of AI and data analytics, Joanna is passionate about the benefit of AI in driving lasting and transformative change for social good. So we are delighted to have you, Dr. Joanna Badstone. The floor is yours.
Murali, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to showcase the work we have underway at Monash University. and the role that the Monash Data Futures Institute plays in highlighting opportunities to drive advances in AI and data science for social good. Today, I plan to cover examples of potential AI applications in disaster management and risk reduction efforts around bushfires, or wildfires as they're often known, floods, and our technology needs for the future, to illustrate how AI applications can help bridge knowledge gaps and generate an evidence base to inform disaster risk recovery strategies for the future. Let's start with fire and some data points. Many of us remember that in the 2019 to 2020 summer, Australia experienced terrible bushfires that burned over 46 million acres, destroyed over 5,900 buildings, including about 2,800 homes, killed at least 34 people, and estimates suggest over 3 billion animals died. In 2020, this year, we're seeing record-breaking fires sweep through parts of the Western United States, burning millions of acres in California and Oregon, devastating towns, and blanketing communities in thick smoke. And last summer in Europe, as Europe experienced significant heat waves, firefighters battled fires at a scale not seen for 20+ years in Spain and southern France. So how can we build a resilient and sustainable future? Our researchers at Monash University have been studying bushfire disasters and recovery response for many years in order to understand the causes and long-term impact of the bushfires and to lead in prevention and prediction efforts. Leveraging data science, indicators of an early fire season in Queensland last year included low soil moisture and exceptionally dry conditions. So our researchers in Monash Civil Engineering applied remotely sensed data from satellites to build environmental hazard and risk applications. They study soil moisture and atmospheric temperature as key drivers of bushfire risks to enable development of a more robust and stable drought index. High-resolution satellite data can help us define the fire hotspots, and in fact, the areas that potentially could be treated through preventive burning. Now, vegetation maps can also be constructed with satellite data. Using data sourced from the European Space Agency's Sentinel-2 satellite and analyzing more than 4,300 images, Monash University researchers have developed Australia's first high-resolution vegetation map, in this case focused on the state of Victoria. And using time series classification, the team built models and annotated data to distinguish different types of land use. For example, different crop types, corn or wheat, different types of vegetation coverage, and importantly, the identification and location of trees along major roads. These maps have the potential to assist with fire prevention, agricultural planning, flood modeling, pollution management, and rehabilitation. And it's critical to know the condition of trees and grasslands, in particular their vegetation water content in biomass, in order to derive high quality fuel load maps that can be used to model how bushfires spread and how prescribed burns can be conducted. The amount of rain absorption into soil after a rain event is essentially dictated by the type of vegetation. And so these vegetation maps can aid in flood management too. We've talked about analysis of satellite data. However, it's hard to see through clouds. In fact, much of the tropics is covered by cloud most of the time. It's been estimated through studies of 12 years worth of satellite imagery that on average, approximately 67% of the Earth is obscured by cloud cover. So how do you handle this? Our researchers are developing machine learning systems that predict what is obscured by cloud cover through extrapolation from what used to be there and what is nearby. Let's move from fire to water. The first example of our flood modeling work comes from India. As many of you know, India ranks as one of the world's most flood-prone countries, with more than 12% of its geographical area likely to flood. Indian communities desperately need life-saving assistive technology that can help prepare for these kinds of freak weather events. Our scientists at IITB Monash Research Academy have analyzed flood-prone areas in Kerala in southwest India using data science analysis from real-time global navigational satellite signals. We were able to identify the presence of surface water across India, and we've created a flood mapping tool that can help authorities warn communities of imminent threats to life during extreme rainfall. A second example of our work on flood modeling comes from Indonesia, which is a country where disasters are happening with high frequency. For example, flooding and landslides, earthquakes, volcanic activity, tsunamis. Coupled with the lack of resources and the size of the population, for disaster risk recovery strategies to have impact, they need to be simple, cost-effective, easily deployed, and perhaps developed locally. The Monash Data Futures Institute, Sustainable Development Institute, and Faculty of Business and Economics are working together to develop AI applications to analyze floodplains and to develop predictive models to identify the locations and potential extent of flooding under future scenarios of climate change and urban growth. These models can help to inform decisions for investment in infrastructure to mitigate or lessen disaster impacts. AI applications, together with citizen science methods to empower community engagement, can also help build a local understanding of the potential impacts of disaster and empower communities to take action in reducing the risk. For example, by managing local waste so that drains are not clogged, or by planting riverbanks to prevent erosion and landslides. To summarize some of the key messages and opportunities for disaster risk reduction, we need standardization of approaches and data sets and methods to access data. We need better data, real-time data, new types of data, coordinated data from agencies, communities, global governments, and international collaborations. And given the predictions of more prolonged and extreme bushfire risk under climate change, we must focus on making better use of the vast amounts of satellite data we have available. Many disaster risk reduction approaches today rely on single data streams, for example, assessing rainfall or temperature or vegetation, and we need to bring those data sets together. AI is clearly needed. The sheer volumes of data generated by satellites and remote monitoring will require additional advances in deep learning and other AI methods to drive new insights. However, it's not just about technology. Disaster risk reduction requires engagement with local people and an understanding of the culture and traditions within the countries. So in conclusion, thanks to the AI for Good Global Summit and ITU for providing a forum for this dialogue today on International Risk Reduction Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. I was very impressed by your approach to use data science to bridge the cloud. Coming from Kerala, I'm also very interested to learn that you are doing an AI-based flood modeling. Thank you.
Thank you.
I now have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Sella Nevo, who is a senior software engineer in Google. He is committed to enacting large-scale effective social impact, and he specializes in machine learning research and development. Sella is currently leading the Google Flood Forecasting Initiative, which aims to produce high accuracy flood forecast and warning, alongside several other humanitarian and environmental efforts by Google. He also teaches applied ethics and information security at the Tel Aviv University and advises venture capitalists on investment in startups advancing UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Sendai, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mawali. And it's an honor to be here. I hope you can see my screen. So today I want to talk about a specific intervention that Google has been doing recently. For about a decade, Google has been providing people around the world with real-time alerts and information during crises and natural disasters. To do this, we collaborate with governments and international organizations to help make sure that critical life-saving information reaches the people who need it. But a few years ago, we realized that distributing existing information is not always enough. For example, we visited the Narwar village in Bihar, India, only a couple of days after the flood you're seeing now. When we arrived, only a handful of houses were left standing. And tragically, 2 people died that night. Sadly, this case is not an outlier. Floods are the most common and one of the most deadly natural disasters on the planet. They're responsible for between thousands and tens of thousands of fatalities every year. On the brighter side, though, much of the harms of flooding are also incredibly preventable. Early warnings can double the number of people who evacuate and take other protective actions and significantly reduce flood-related fatalities. This is why we've started the Google Flood Forecasting Initiative. We believe everyone should have access to flood warnings so they can stay safe and informed. And for that to happen, the underlying technology must be one that is computationally scalable and sustainable enough to span the entire globe. We currently focus on riverine floods as opposed to flash floods, coastal floods, and so on. There's a lot we believe Google can do to help move the needle, from vast computational resources to machine learning expertise. Yet we recognize we're really only here to help others. Governments are the ones with the infrastructure and the mandate to take care of the safety of their citizens, and most of the relevant experience and expertise lies in organizations who have been doing this important work since before Google was even founded. This is why we're engaging with the UN, governments, NGOs, and academic institutions to combine our strengths and find genuinely innovative solutions. Broadly speaking, these kinds of systems can be divided into 3 components: the hydrologic model, the inundation model, and the distribution of warnings. Let's go over them one by one and see how machine learning can be relevant. The hydrologic model accepts inputs like precipitation, solar radiation, and others, and produces a forecast for discharge or water level throughout the river. The classic approach for these kinds of models is to have each component represent a separate physics-based process. In practice, we don't have nearly enough data to actually simulate the physics, so we use simple conceptual models. This methodology has several limitations, from simplistic representation of the processes through overfitting and the requirement of continuous manual calibration of experts, leading these models to be expensive and not sufficiently scalable. We replaced this conceptual modeling with LSTMs, a neural network architecture specialized for time series. We don't explicitly model any part of the process, but allow the network to learn more complex representations than classic models are able to support. We've been able to show that these LSTM-based models can achieve significantly better results than classical models. I won't have time to fully explain this graph, but each line here represents a different hydrologic model, and all you need to know is that lower is better. These new LSTM-based models not only achieve significantly better performance, but they also scale and generalize better. They can be trained across hundreds of sites with a single click, as opposed to classic models, which need to be calibrated manually across each site. We're continuing to improve these architectures, for example, more recently working on creating models that can communicate information to downstream sites, as well as combine transfer learning between sites with per site specialization. But while it's always fun to talk about the academic breakthroughs, it's no less important to tackle the practical issues that are inherent to real-world data and operational systems. Reducing data latency, detecting and correcting errors in data collection, and increasing the speed and frequency at which these models are run is perhaps less sexy, but critically important to take these models out of academia and allowing them to create change on the ground. We've talked a bit about the hydrologic model. Let's move on to the second component of an actionable flood forecasting system, the inundation model. Inundation models simulate the water's behavior across the floodplain, like you're seeing on the screen right now. This allows us to understand what areas exactly are going to be affected by an upcoming flood, and as a result, identify in advance who needs to be warned of danger, and no less importantly, where they can go to be safe. The classic way to implement these simulations is through physics-based hydraulic models, solving differential equations on a grid. We've originally implemented such models ourselves, so we can run them on Google supercomputers and specialized hardware. But even if you have a perfect model, there are still a few challenges to address. Here you can see an example of one of the first alerts we ever sent out in Patna. Blue areas are areas that are flooded and receive our alerts. Purple areas were not flooded, but still received an alert. We wanted to warn people who were close to flooding as well, so we felt comfortable with this purple buffer you're seeing surrounding a flood. And red areas are areas that were flooded, but didn't receive an alert. As you can see, we have few red areas, but there's this big red blob at the top, which frustrated us for months. It doesn't physically make sense for water to get there. We see that there's a huge embankment between the river and that area. We were so frustrated that we flew out to Patna and asked local farmers what happened. And they said, oh, when we want to water our crops, we just dig a hole in the embankment so that the water will reach the relevant fields. Now, of course, there's no way for us to see this from the satellite data we have access to, but we do see that historically this place consistently gets flooded. So we asked, why can't we have our models learn this automatically? What we do is try to combine both the data that we do know, like the elevation maps and so on, along with learning from real-time occurrences, the parts that we don't. The idea is trying to separate these out properly. To accomplish this, we've developed what we call the morphological model. It combines a machine learning model to estimate the river profile, which is simple, but we have little prior information about, with a physics-based model to expand that profile to the two-dimensional floodplain. This allows us to produce extremely accurate models at scale. Here we can see a real-life example. While we were visiting India, we walked up all the way to where our live alerting system said flooding should begin, and indeed found water beginning where we forecasted. But of course, the reason we're doing all of this work is to warn people and to protect them. We have three main strategies for doing so. First, we use Google's public alerts infrastructure. This allows us to send these alerts to millions of affected people through Google Search, Maps, and through smartphone notifications. We've redesigned it to support detailed, actionable, and visual information that people need at times of flooding. Sadly, though, many people who need this information don't have access to the internet. That's why we fund and collaborate with local NGOs so they can provide this information to those in need and are not connected to the internet. We've started a collaboration with the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies to provide community-based alerting for those who would otherwise not have access. And finally, we have specialized interfaces and notifications for governments and disaster management agencies. They can see everything going on in the country in one aggregated place. Our operational systems currently cover more than 200 million people in India and Bangladesh, and we're working hard to expand coverage to others. Just these past few months, we've sent out 36 million warnings to people directly on their mobile devices. As we scale, we're finding that people on the ground don't just use our alerts, but also send them to friends, families, and neighbors to make sure others stay safe as well. Thank you all for your time, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sela, for this very interesting presentation. The fact that we could do a lot more flood modeling with AI, and with one click, you could reach many catchments as against having to model each one and every catchment is very inspiring indeed. I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Preeti Bensal, who is the advisor and scientist at the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India. She worked before as the Director of Future Networks in the Telecommunication Engineering Center, Technical Research and Standardization arm of the Department of Telecommunications and to the Ministry of Telecommunications in India. She holds a PhD in disaster communication and early warning systems. She has about 27 years of experience working in telecommunication policy setting, standardization, emergency communication, telecom project management, corporate restructuring, and capacity building. During her stint at the National Disaster Management Authority of India, NDMA, She has been instrumental in implementing programs on disaster risk management in India. Preeti, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mule. Am I audible to all of you?
Yes.
Thank you. So, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all live audience of this webinar. My co-panelists, Shauna and Mr. Sala, have clearly led the floor for talking about how AI is very useful for DRR. I'm going to start right from the basic concepts of DRR. So if we go to the classic definition of DRR, it is defined as the potential loss of life, injury, or losses to assets, which could occur to an individual, organization, system, or community. So basically, DRR is aimed at preventing new disaster, reducing existing disaster risk, and managing the residual risk. In the technical sense, it is defined through the combinations of three terms. First, the probability of happening such event, exposure and vulnerability, and above all, the coping capacity of the affected community. So if we want to plan any program or strategy for DRR, we have to take into account all three factors, and we need to build a holistic, multi-pronged approach which provides solution to all natural and human-induced disasters, which take care of vulnerability of people, livestock, assets, and infrastructure, and most importantly, aimed at enhancing coping capacity of the community. So in total, it is a combination of prevention, mitigation, preparedness, capacity building of community, and risk governance. So again, if we go back to the DRR context, there was a Hydrologic framework of action on DRM, which was in place for year 2005 and 2015. And in year 2015, which was a landmark year with three major international and multilateral policy agreement to its account. The one is the Sendai Framework for DRR, which aims for substantial reduction of disaster risk and associated losses. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals with 17 goals and 169 targets, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. And if we see all these three agreements, they cannot be seen in isolation. If we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we can reduce people's vulnerability and we can enhance their coping capacity. If we are able to meet the targets of climate change adaptation and mitigation, this would lead us to eco-friendly, sustainable development and can certainly reduce the frequency of climate change-induced natural disasters such as heat waves. Recently it was talked about. So now coming to the role of technology in DRR. We know that ICT have been playing a very important role in DRR since quite long. We have been using radio, television, fax, telex, mobile, VSETs, and so on and so forth. But the frontier technology, such as Internet of Things, the newer generation of wireless technologies, LTE and IMT 2020, or 4G and 5G in general, we refer to them as 4G and 5G. New satellite technologies, radars, intelligent drones, and above all, the artificial intelligence and machine learning, they are really going to be game changer. The combination of these technologies certainly are going to bring about a paradigm shift in DRR policy governance, systems, and processes. Now coming to the role of these technologies in DRR. My co-panelists have already talked about the flood modeling and modeling for wildfires. So traditionally, if you start, say, for pre-disaster actions like prevention, mitigation, and preparedness, They started with the risk model, which talked about the type of hazard, the type of vulnerability of people, exposure of people, and the coping capacity. So it was like hazard, risk, vulnerability analysis with macro and micro zonation, mapping them on the layered GIS maps and the existing resources mapping. AI can certainly be very helpful in this, and I'm quite hopeful that Mr. Badlami is going to discuss about this in his presentation. Now coming to the early warnings and the prediction modeling. So just now we have seen how Google is doing it for the flood and the other hydrological climate changes and disasters. These techniques are very much useful by using existing satellite imageries, training the machine learning algorithms, and using them for the forecasting in the early morning. I would like to give example of Berlin University and the German Research Center for Geosciences in Potsdam. Now they are using these technologies of using the satellite imagery and artificial intelligence, and they observe the precursory signals for the volcanoes, the changes sort of like change in the seismic behavior, the ground information, gas emission, temperature rise, etc., so that they can release volcano eruption early warnings. AI can also be used for different areas, like it can be used for continuous analysis of videos frame by frame, so that it can detect cracks in big structures like dams, bridges, towers, nuclear reactors. And in this way, it can be very helpful for early detection of potential hazards. If I talk about the internet-based sensors, the new set of cyber-physical systems, they can be very helpful. Just now, like Sela has talked about the mobile app-based alert system, which can be helpful for the community-based disaster risk management system. And IIT Bombay had recently developed this kind of AI-based algorithm, which can help track natural disaster on the ground, monitor cities from the sky, help security forces to identify insurgents in the dark, and it can be used for many things. Now coming to the response and relief function, how AI can be helpful in these functions. So here I would like to talk about drones. Presently, drones with computer vision are being used for high resolution mapping. These images are annotated and used as training data to create AI model for drones. And with these models, easily we can identify people and can be helpful for the search, rescue, and relief functions. These AI-based drones can also be used for post-disaster need assessment, we call it PDNA, and this can feed to long-term and short-term recovery plans. Now coming to the very important thing, that is social media, the role of social media in disaster. So we know that when a disaster strikes, people resort to the social media with their real-time updates. This crowdsourced data is extensively being used for response and relief functions. In India, during the Chennai and Kochi floods, the big data analytics and AI were used to extract relevant information from social media updates, and they were used to facilitate government relief mechanisms and also to connect large set of philanthropic and civil society volunteers who were assisting in relief and recovery operations. In current COVID-19 pandemic situation as well, AI and machine learning are being used extensively in various activities. For example, they can be used for faster chest CT scan reading. They can be used for the calculation estimates in vaccine research activities, geofencing of people who have been tested COVID positive, so on and so forth. One good example I would like to give, during initial lockdown period in India in March 2020, a robot was being used by a private hospital as front-end primary support. It could use the thermal sensor, could ask few questions, and then would allow patients access to the hospital services. Otherwise, the patient was transferred to the COVID center. Even presently, during the pandemic situation, the cloud-based health ecosystem are also being deployed with accessibility through mobile apps, through smart wearable devices. And these are used for distant observation and offering prescription to people in home quarantine. So we can give many examples of these kinds. Now coming to the AI use cases, which are very close to my heart. As an AI evangelist, for its capability to empower people, I am for a responsible, sustainable, and inclusive AI. We know about the natural language processing, NLP. This is a field of computer science and AI, and is related to interaction between computers and the human languages. So by using NLP for language translation, AI system can create early warnings simultaneously in many vernacular languages. In a country like India, which has about 20,000 languages and dialects, such system designed for talking to people, educating them what to do during disaster when disaster strikes, or issuing warning in their own native languages is simply amazing. Similarly, AI-enabled apps, specifically designed for persons with disabilities, can adequately inform them in real time about warning alerts, of course, about an impending disaster, and can also guide them towards nearest community shelter. So such tools can be so helpful and empowering for people with specific needs. A conversational AI can be designed for counseling to disaster-affected people who are in trauma or are suffering through mental disorders and psychosomatic problems. It can be very helpful for them. Here I would like to mention about happiness curriculum program launched by Government of India and government-funded school. In this curriculum, through various activities, students are taught how to inculcate constructive mental habits, how to cultivate optimism, how to be joyous and happy in life. Yes. So recently, one small girl from one of these schools has created an AI-based application for people suffering from depression due to current pandemic situation.
Yes.
I consider, sorry.
Preeti, if I could just ask you to conclude because we are running out of time.
Yeah. So I consider AI a very path-breaking technology. We can collectively create an AI-aided, smart, equitable, and sustainable society. Thank you.
Thank you, Preeti. I was very inspired by the very practical uses, such as the ability to convert warnings into local languages. Even during COVID, we are having big trouble with all the migrants. Now, how do we communicate in their own languages? And a lot of misinformation was going around. Thank you. I now have the pleasure of inviting Eve Bartholomew, who is a senior geospatial and resilience specialist at the World Bank. He has been working in many African countries over the last 20 years, and most recently for the World Bank Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, leading Drone for Development study tours in Seychelles, Zambia, and team leader for the Zanzibar Mapping Initiative project, the largest drone mapping project in the world. For more than 15 years, he has also been associated with the United Nations Environment Program, working in post-conflict and post-disaster countries around the world. He also has been a guest lecturer at the Science Po, World Maritime University, State University of Zanzibar, and he has also been part of the organizing team for the Understanding Risk series of events of the World Bank. Eve holds a master's degree in tropical ecology and master's in geoinformation. Eve, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Murali. Very impressive presentation. Well, I gave it to you, in fact, so that's why maybe. But thank you so much for inviting me today to this panel. It's really a great honor and a true pleasure to be here today. Thanks to all panelists also, and thanks to the audience. I think this is the first time I will Zoom with so many people. That's really great. I think it would be great also to see a map of where all people come from after this session. I can see a few people, messages coming from different places. So today I would like to maybe demystify a bit AI and give a few examples of why we use AI, how we use it, and maybe how we would like it to be or we want it to be. But first of all, I mean, let me remind you the objective of the World Bank, which are, we have two main goals, which are end extreme poverty and promote shared prosperity in a sustainable way. So how can AI help the bank reach these goals? So let's focus today on disaster risk reduction. We saw many different examples, but disasters for sure happen every day. And we had several examples already mentioned. And there is something that is for sure is that it's always hurt more the poorest and the most vulnerable. So I would say that one of the objectives of the bank and the role that it has to play is to, because we are working with many different clients in the world, but it's really to support them, to support the client to assess exposure to hazards and address disaster risks, amongst many other things, but this is really a very important objective. And when you see understanding and quantifying disaster risk, it requires accessible, detailed, up-to-date geospatial data. If you want to work on exposure, you need to have the buildings. You need to know where people live, how they live also. It's not only about where they live, but it's also about how their houses could resist to a flood, to an earthquake, okay? So what we could call the vulnerability also. So all of these you need to have. When you see, I've been working mostly on the African continent these last years, but we say often that 15% of the African continent is less, than 15% is mapped at scale. And cities are really growing fast. So it's very difficult to assess risk when you don't know where people live. So a lot of people are not on the map today, the one we call the invisible. And this is really important to have them on the map. So we can say that traditional urban data collection methods can't keep up. So it's good to have a bit of disruption into this mapping world, into this geospatial, to help the geospatial ecosystem and the solutions, bring solutions to that. So this is where AI comes in. So for some of, in a way, AI is not science fiction, in the end, I've listened already some examples on remote sensing. Some people think, and I think they are right, that they have been doing AI maybe without knowing it since a long time, So, and DRM resilience professionals are in fact increasingly using machine learning algorithms to collect better data about risk and vulnerability and make more informed decisions. But maybe I could go through quickly a few examples of how we are using AI for DRR. In Zanzibar, and we have done, for example, well, you were mentioning one of the largest drone, if not the largest one, drone mapping project. When I say largest one, this means that it's a civil project we have mapped all Zanzibar with drones and with local pilots there. And what we did, we used that drone imagery and we extracted the building roof print automatically using the drone image and using machine learning. And not only we got the footprint, but also the building condition, where the buildings finished or were they incomplete, which is very important because now we have other projects from the bank where we are working on flood modeling and that all this information will be used. In Guatemala also, I mean, we are using and combining drones, point cloud elevation data, and also street view, which are these images that you collect from the street using maybe 360 cameras or even your mobile phone sometime. And combining these, we will identify homes that are at high risk for collapse during an earthquake. In Kinshasa and Abidjan, we are now using street view again, but in some flood-prone areas where we are going to use machine learning to extract detailed exposure data. So building material, number of stories, informal businesses, all of these very important data when we are working on disaster risk. Because disaster risk, we need to understand also what will be the cost of a disaster. We have to prepare that also. In Kabul, machine learning was used also to process input satellite imagery in order to separate informal settlements from formal ones. Okay, so that with the importance here is more to mix multi-satellite imagery. So in the end, I mean, we could have a very, very long list of AI applications. In a way, AI applications is also a continuation of big data. It's a mix of data science, of machine learning. So yes, we can use all of these for many different applications. 8 minutes, I don't have the time to go into the details of all of them. But what is important is that how would we like this revolution, AI revolution to be? I think it's important to have an AI that should be open as possible, meaning open data, opening data not only for input data, but data outputs from the model should be also open. Opening code, libraries, so AI, it's quite easy also to build some black box where you don't really know what's inside. So it's important to open that. Open training data sets, meaning give the opportunity also to others to try a different algorithm based on a training data sets to feed their computers. Open skills, okay? So in a way, make sure that we democratize the disaster risk management process so that more people can use it. AI should be ethic. AI should be for good, and which is also why we are here today. Some of my colleague panelists already mentioned that it's also very important to limit the bias, because bias in, bias out. Let's make sure that computers are fed with unbiased training data sets, because if you don't train well a computer, then the result, I'm not sure, will be of a great quality and could be problematic. AI should benefit local, so community should give inputs also when there are projects, AI projects, where results will affect their communities. Residents should be empowered. Communities should access to results. It should also provide opportunities for local ecosystems. So here we see a lot of opportunities. We are mentioning a certain number of different sensors like drones. So yes, we need more drone pilots. We need more street view teams to collect hyper-local data. We need mobile data collectors. We need labels and AI validators also. So a lot of job opportunities potentially. So last slide or last what I could say is that I would like to flag that we are working, there is the African Drone Forum where you can find plenty of information on what we do more on the drone side. Open Cities for Africa, which is how we disrupt locally the way data are created and local data feeding AI. Open DRI, where disaster risk open data for resilience initiative from the bank. You can find a lot of information on what we are doing, blogs and technical reports. and the Resilience Academy, which is how to a university network to build the skills and make sure that they are sustainable. So finally, to conclude, AI, I would say for sure, is much more than a buzzword. AI can help reduce extreme poverty by reducing risk disasters. It can be an opportunity for bridging global and hyper-local ecosystems. Thank you so much. Over to you, Murali, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Yves. Very interesting points. One thing which you mentioned has already been requested by a number of people who are listening. It's about the training data sets. So can some of the training data sets be made available? And the question of ethics has also come up multiple times in the discussion. So good points. Thank you. I now have the pleasure to introduce the final speaker of the day, Mr. Adam Fish, who is at the UN Office for the Disaster Risk Reduction. He is the coordinator of the Global Risk Assessment Framework and the part lead author in the Global Risk Assessment Framework 2019 and 2022. He is also the part author of the special report on drought. Previously, he worked in UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction Regional Office in Africa in program delivery, World Food Programme's early warning section, German Red Cross community-based disaster risk reduction and early warning, UNICEF, and IFRC. Adam, you have the floor.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. I have the unenviable task of following such esteemed experts, but I do have the advantage in that I am not of this world. I'm not an AI specialist. I'm a disaster risk reduction specialist. So in a way, I permit myself to approach this with some naivete when it comes to talking about sensors and computations. Definitely not my strong point. What I will try to do, though, is think about how where the places are for the AI community to really get involved in reducing risk. And I have to thank Dr. Banzal in particular for giving a very good primer on the construction of risk and the options for managing risk, including preventing the construction of new risk, reducing existing risk, and then managing what risk we cannot reduce. And I think those are important frames for some of the elements I'll say now. So yeah, I do come from UNDRR. We are the custodian agency of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And as I said, I have the advantage in this because I'm not trying to put AI into the service of DRR. I'm really trying to think instead about where AI fits into how we can reduce risk. And I know there's a lot of interest in applying the strengths of AI in forecasting hazards. That's forecasting the occurrence and incidence of hazards. And that's probably becoming less and less true of the owners and providers of AI services and increasingly true of policymakers and decision makers. The providers are increasingly conscious, I think, of the challenges and diminishing returns of predicting an increasingly complex and inscrutable future. And then those decision makers are increasingly hopeful of the glossy promises of someone who can maybe shoulder some of the challenge, some of the difficulty of guessing what might happen next in a very turbulent world and take some of the stress out of their lives and professions. So I'm going to outline 4 things that I think are the elements that are necessary for reducing risk to really happen. And they link to the availability of compelling evidence, so the foundation of data, and I heard you talking a bit about that, about transparency and co-design, and we heard a little bit already about bringing stakeholders into the community of people, both contributing to the understanding risk, but also contributing their knowledge about where risk resides in their communities. And then also to incentives and what helps people or enables people to make those risk-informed decisions. And they're all equally important to each other. As I go through them, I'll try to highlight where I think AI can connect to these, but I suspect that the other smart people on the panel and indeed in the audience would probably have much more practical and realistic ideas about what's possible. I would say that if disaster risk increases, and it really is in most parts of the world, risk is increasing for various reasons, but it's probably because one or more of these elements is missing. So as I said, I've got 4. The first one is expanding the data ecosystem. This is the obvious one, and I think the obvious one for AI, so I'm going to make it the shortest. This is really about acknowledging that the sources of information that we have traditionally used to predict the incidence or impact of disasters are increasingly inadequate. When we look at the mega bushfires in Australia or of COVID-19, to take 2 very punctual examples, our risk assessment tools were nowhere near capturing exactly the scale, exactly the incidence of these things. The interconnection of the world is making it much harder for our old tools to still be useful. I guess the upshot of that, though, is that there are massive volumes of risk information that reside in ministries and departments and institutions and communities and in the knowledge bases that people have around the world that we're not able to use. I say we, I suspect most of us in this audience, to understand where risk resides and how to present it. So I guess for me, the role for AI in this case is probably better used to demonstrate to those owners of the hidden, private, locked caches of data, risk information, what is actually possible when we open things up. And I thank you for highlighting that. It's not just open data, it's open models, it's open outputs, it's open everything. And there really is massive ground to be made when it comes to what's possible by including more and opening it up. I think that the AI community could also highlight some of the benefits of how those Excel files that are probably passed around on very corrupted USB drives across the ministry, but are still considered super private, or the community risk maps that are rotting away in a conference room flip chart somewhere, could probably change the way that risk is understood and managed in those specific communities that it's meant to help. But it's a question of unlocking the door. The second element is mapping the true topography of risk. Risk profiles often suffer by taking a supply-driven approach. And tell me if you can hear somebody already saying, we've got a great flood model, we can apply some multi-comparison approaches and maybe a few different concentration pathways, and that's it, we've got a great risk assessment. But there's risk in everything, right? There's risk in development and exposure. So the starting point should instead be trying to find out what the decision makers are concerned about, what risk they're trying to resolve, and what their capacities are and what their priorities are. And then we can figure out how to answer their questions rather than pushing something to them. Most of the people who are in a position to reduce risk, though, have more modest targets than no flooding. Their objectives are probably more like, we need to reduce the cost of infrastructure repairs due to water damage, or our education outcomes are suffering because the schools keep getting used as emergency shelters. I think that the false confidence that can sometimes come with, here's the flood model so you understand what to do next, can actually end up doing more harm than good. So it really comes down to answering those questions that people have that will help them to reduce risk in their particular context. My advice for the AI community in that case is 2-part. One, to join us in sort of stepping back and participating in a bit more of a co-designed approach and not rushing to give planners or other decision makers what you have, but start with their interests and try to answer their questions. And the second part is the stronger capacity, I guess, in AI in stress testing different scenarios and understanding what the influencing factors are for risk, rather than trying to anticipate specific events. I'll put it in a slightly different way. Don't try to pinpoint where the next COVID will emerge. That's very specific and very challenging. Probably it won't, and then you'll be wrong. Instead, try to teach us what you can about what influences the spread, what drives diffusion, for example. That, I think, is a really rich avenue for AI. The third element is in developing the decision compass. And this has 2 parts also. This is both about including a richer community and the co-design process. So people in a country who see themselves as having a role to play in reducing risks, that group needs to become a bigger group. Normally, when we hear about disaster risk, for example, we think of first responders, we think of disaster managers, we think of the NDMAs, and they're really important. But risk is constructed by everyone. New exposure, new developments, a new hotel on the waterfront is actually adding new risk. So we need to involve those people in understanding both what's going to happen when they do that and how they can reduce risk. In the previous point about mapping the topography of risk, we could think of our partners as being that transport engineer or the education policy planner. Those people don't often think of themselves as risk reducers in the way that we need them to if we need to meet the objective of the Sendai Framework. We need a lot more hands working on the task. The second part is we need to build the capacity of people to interrogate the risk information on their own terms. And again, this links to that openness. So we need people to have the capacity to understand what it's saying and to ask questions of data sets or of resources, AI or otherwise, that will help them to answer what they're really trying to answer. They might not know what's possible. They may not know what evidence is available or how to use it or understand its limitations. This is a capacity building job for the AI community that's not related to the accuracy of computations or leading thinking. It's really related to building up the cohort of people that you're trying to help. It also gives you a base of interested and supportive and informed allies in a position to use the tools that you're producing in AI to reduce risk. And it gives them a platform to understand and make decisions in their own context. The fourth one is reinforcing the incentives to reduce risk. This is probably the most controversial one. People act contrary to evidence all the time for lots and lots of reasons. The incentives to build risk through the expansion, through development are really strong, and they're always rewarded with positive attention from the media and voters. So this is really about helping donors, development, project finance, insurance, to find ways to reward those efforts that treat risk honestly, and that risk reduction is possible. And it can be a bit controversial. Imagine a perfect risk assessment, the most 100% accurate, impossibly perfect risk assessment, designed in a super participatory process, linked with clear, actionable initiatives that could reduce risk. And the number one recommendation in that hypothetical risk assessment is that in order to reduce riverbank erosion, reduce biodiversity loss, and stop leaching chemicals into the lake, all you have to do is make 100 meters on either side of the river a public conservation area free from development. Fine. Then a consortium proposes that they could put 6 new chemical facilities in that area and add 1,500 jobs, and all they would require is a modest consideration in taxes. We know what's going to happen. The factories are going up. It's not the risk reduction. So what we really need to do is to be sensitizing those people who are in a position to influence where capital flows, to participate in reducing risk and to sort of, I guess, take individual sacrifices in the interest of the greater good. And this is really, really the hardest part. The AI community is innovative and creative and disruptive in really the best possible way. It holds immense promise in supporting a shift towards risk-resilient development, in support of the Sendai Framework, in support of the SDGs. The flyer for this panel promised to explore the important challenges and considerations in employing AI technology for DRR. Now, the first 3 things I mentioned are real and they're important, but unless we can make the connection to decision makers in a way that short circuits that incentive to consume or be reelected or appear on TV or be personally enriched, which are all really attractive, and make the incentives to protect people, protect ecosystems, traditions, reduce vulnerability, and ensure accountability more attractive, we will not only fail to meet the SDGs and Sendai, but we're going to see more damaging, more frequent disasters than you can even imagine. This isn't really an opportunity for the AI community. This is an imperative to support the owners of capital, to see the opportunities to reduce risk, support communities who are interested in not suffering themselves, and really advance, I guess, the AI community's thinking, not just from the technical accuracy perfection perspective, but also in the inclusive global public good perspective. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam, for those very insightful remarks. Driven by the power of technology, we often forget that people may not be needing exactly your technological solutions. We have received dozens of questions in the question and answer segment, as well as in the chat segment. A number of those questions have been answered by subsequent presenters as well, and I have seen some live answering as well. But I have picked up some questions, and I would start with Joanna. Joanna, coming from the private sector into the university system now. One question is, how can universities support the government in improving the utilization of AI for disaster risk reduction? And similarly, what would be your expectation from the governments around the world to support the university and the industry to invest more in AI for disaster risk reduction? Joanna.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So the first point I would make is that the organizations and global frameworks and partnerships are really important. We've heard many examples today around projects and experiences in different countries, and there's just so much to learn from each other's experiences. One of the things that we had done recently was a partnership between government and Australia, government and France to sponsor a bushfire science workshop with the French Embassy and the group of 8 universities in Australia, along with government participation from CSIRO and some of the government investments and sponsorships around the bushfire and natural hazards CLC. That linkage between government, policy, university, and data, and the sharing of experiences from what does it mean to study bushfires in Australia compared to the experiences of what does it mean to study in France is really important, because the models that we develop in one country need to be extendable and extensible and retrainable for the specific environment in a second country. So that cross-country collaboration, I think, is really important. The second point is around, again, local governments and partnerships and universities. Again, we really need data scientists, environmental scientists, climate scientists, and engineers to collaborate with operational agencies, with industry, with private sector, because we have tremendous, if we think about the integration possibilities, we've got tremendous worldwide scientific capabilities. We have huge data resources available if we were to pool our efforts. And so this view of really collaborating and integrating a network of universities, a network of government agencies, input and support from industry, right? We had some great work from Google today, linking into agencies, space agencies, World Meteorological Organization, putting that infrastructure and that framework of organizations together, I think would really help us to be able to inform better practices and start to put programs in place to address other high-risk areas. And so it's really that integration, public, private sector, open domain, shareable data, and the integration of all of this so that we can move this whole discussion forward.
Thank you, Joanna. Indeed, I think collaboration is the key, and this will be one of the call which will make based on this session that there is a lot more collaboration of those agencies, UN, government, private sector, which is needed to achieve. I would now turn to Sela. Sela, you may have noticed that there are many questions out there which are primarily directed to you, which is some of them are purely about the technology part of it, so I'm not answering them. And what algorithm was used, what data set was used, etc. So if you could just have a look at those questions and maybe give some responses, that would be good. But one question which I have for you is also something which Adam referred to. It's about the availability of data. So what is really your key constraint in going global? Google has the backbone system to go global. The platform is there. So what is your main constraint? Is it the existence of the data, the access to the data, or the limitation of the algorithm at this point? Over to you.
Yeah, so that's a great question. First, just to mention, I've been trying to answer the questions as fast as I can. I've answered, I think, several dozens, but I apologize for those that I haven't answered yet. I'm still working on it. So yeah, in terms of what are the constraints and what are the data, I really do think that we've reached a stage where I think the data is more of a constraint than the modeling itself. This isn't to say, I think this applies to our work and it applies to a lot of other applications of machine learning in disaster response. I'm definitely not saying that there's not additional work to be done on modeling. There's a lot of additional work to be done on modeling. But if I could choose one of them, over the next year, what will I significantly improve in? I think we are blocked by availability of data much more than the modeling itself. I think there are indeed many countries that are still struggling with collecting the data necessary. And I noticed there was a comment on that in the Q&A as well. But what often pains me more is when countries do have that collection, but haven't yet realized the value of open data and the incredible progress that it can spur. And I think that countries that do make their data open and public, the parts that they can responsibly do so, I think it really spurs the academic community to do a lot of work that it's really hard to do without all of this data. So I think my answer to that is really, I think if I could click my fingers and get one thing for next year, it would be to have more data collected, more data made public, and for that data to be more standardized, much like Joanna mentioned earlier. So yeah, definitely a critically important aspect of this field. Thank
you. Sela, Adam also made reference to this, that even when data is around, on a floppy disk, on a flash drive, it's not often shared, even though it is actually going corrupted. I have a question to Preeti, and I'm also hoping Bilal could chip in. This is about standardization. ITU is all about standardization. So the question is, could standardizing some of the approaches or some of the questions help in directing the AI effort for disaster risk reduction? So if so, what are some of your suggestions? Because as a part of the panel, we could also propose to ITU and as well as to the global community to start to think of standardizing some of these topics as well as the challenging areas. Preeti.
Dr. Malik. Yeah, the answer of the first question is that, yes, the standardization process definitely play a big role. If we take the example of telecom, if ITU starts standardization, it does a mainstreaming of the subject into routine telecommunication activities. And it gives due importance and attention to the subject. So certainly, standardization should start in the field of AI. And as Mr. Bilal has already talked about many initiatives of ITUT in the areas of emergency communications and PPDR, the public protection and disaster response. But if you ask me, going forward, what we should do, I think ITU should, I think ITU perhaps would like to consider initiating some standardization or framework on AI for DRR. That is the first thing. And also to create framework for explainable and responsible AI. Because going forward, this will be the need of the time. Thank you.
Yes, Bilal, if you want to come in and
yes.
make a remark on the standard, yes.
Yes, I'll be very happy to, and really thank you for the question. It's very timely. If we look at other examples of AI for health, for example, or AI for autonomous and assisted driving, the way that we were able to initiate the standards development activities by creating a focus group on those topics. So we have a focus group, for example, on AI for health that we are co-chairing with the WHO or co-organizing with WHO. And that focus group is looking at how do we benchmark the AI algorithm when it comes to health applications. Similar one for autonomous and assisted driving. how can we benchmark the autonomous driver and see how good they are doing compared to a human driver. In the case of DRR, we could envisage having a focus group that is an open platform for members and non-members of the ITU to really come together from the scientific community, from the practitioners in the field, from the companies, and from the data holders to see how we can, together as a community, look at the use cases of AI for DRR, address some of the questions that were raised today in terms of the data sets, the APIs, the benchmarking of the algorithms to see how accurate they are in predicting, for example, disasters, and come up with some technical reports and papers and possibly specifications to really bring all of these disparate efforts happening all over the world with different communities and bringing the subject matter experts with the AI experts together to develop some output that the rest of the world can use.
Thank you, Bilal. We will certainly include that as part of the chair's summary and then take it forward. We have very limited time, but I have a similar question to both Eve and Adam. So Sela has mentioned, and it is also mentioned by Joanna, that data is really the key. And of course, we have been hearing that data is the new oil for a long time. Now, my question to both of you is, how can your institution, World Bank in the case of Eve, and UN Office for DRR in case of Adam, create some sort of an incentive for member state to be more transparent in at least sharing the data they have, even if they do not have a lot of data. But every government have data, regardless of whether they realize or not. So, like the World Bank has in the past used their leveraging skills to open up parts of the economy, could it be used to open up part of the data? And for Adam, could UN Office for the DRR use their convening power to create more data transparency? Eve first.
Thank you, Murali. Yes, the question of data, for sure. I mean, we always point to the government in saying that they are never sharing data. I guess at some time, they don't always know that they are sitting on plenty of data, or maybe it's a question also of technical knowledge, how to share this data in a good way. So it's not only always that easy. We are, I'm not sure I can have the answer I can make is that on every project we are involved, and I am involved at the bank, we are advocating a lot for the use of open source software, of open data. We are using more and more data coming from OpenStreetMap. So we are also making sure and working on this to make sure that these data sets are of a good quality. So we have developed a project, for example, over the last 2 years that was called Open Cities for Africa, where we have worked with 15 cities in Africa from west to east, francophone, anglophone, and working really on putting together people from governments and young innovators and experts from digital entrepreneur and some community members, and working together. They have really with a co-designed a solution, and where the OpenStreetMap was one of the recipients of the data collected in the field. And this, in a way, makes it become a public good, because everyone in the end is using these data sets. In Zanzibar, we have been mapping I was mentioning the drone project, that just now you can go on the website and have access to all the drone imagery at 7 centimeters. And these data sets have been shared also with the AI community, because we have launched 2 competition, AI competition for developing some building footprint automatic detection. on these data sets. So we are pushing for this in many different countries. So yeah, this could be my answer. You are muted, Murali. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm still learning. Thank you. We have 1 last minute for Adam before I wrap up. Adam.
I'll go very quickly. I think that one of the things that we can do is to show them. We had a great example from Tanzania a couple of years ago where we had done a flood risk assessment and the effect on education infrastructure. We showed to the government the 2,300 school sites available in the global data set on the school infrastructure. We said, this is your flood risk for education. And they said, oh, no, we have 23,000. And suddenly they started to see that their risk information really enriched what was possible in understanding risk from their perspective. UNDRR hosts a framework called the Global Risk Assessment Framework, which is a community that tries to connect risk scientists, decision makers, finance, and other communities to really make the most of that collaboration. That's part of what we do in our global platforms, in our global risk assessment reports, and in this graph, the Global Risk Assessment Framework. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you, Adam. Even though we could continue, we have many questions which are still coming in, but I noticed that the speakers have already answered a number of them. So there are 35 answers already provided, which is quite impressive. I thank all the speakers for making the presentation, as well as finding the time to answer in person, but also on the chat box and the Q&A box. I thank the ITU for providing this platform for us to convene and have this discussion, and the hundreds of participants from around the world who joined the session. The recorded sessions would be available shortly on the Facebook and YouTube sites of ITU. We would actually come out with a summary from the chair on the session with some specific recommendations on how to move this forward. We would be very happy to know that a number of other government, private sector actors had expressed their interest in joining this session as speakers, and we had to move that forward. So we will have a lot more sessions coming in the next few months, and we'll keep you all informed. I thank all of you who joined, as well as those who worked behind the scene to put this excellent session, which went without any technical hitch. Thank you all. Have a good day wherever you are. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. Rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. Selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. Rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. Selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. Selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. Selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. 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 Selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector. Rewind selector.